It's a very good question here, and sadly even a little more relevant now than usual. We see a few cave people running away while one denies the obvious existence of a saber-toothed tiger. Now, why do you think it says that the two on the left are our ancestors, while the guy on the right is nobody's ancestor? What does it pretty strongly imply is about to happen here? Think about that. But in the meantime, it's officially June. This is chapter 13, and just like with this caveman, it's the beginning of the end. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Looking at my calendar, I see 2.5 weeks of school left, which means we have very little left to do. Before we start, I have been told that work needs to all be in by next Friday, June 12th, so just check if you're missing anything in Power School. I think we're probably going to somewhat ignore that deadline by having one last assignment due the following Monday of that last week of school, just so I'm not giving you something on Wednesday and having it due by Friday. Maybe I'll have to, but I think Monday will probably be okay. But otherwise, make sure you get anything that you need to get handed in, turned in by next Friday the 12th. On that note, let's talk some evolution. This is a weird little cartoony version of stuff, but this is how it worked and continues to work. From the first cells a long time ago, changes started to pile up, and between mutations and variations from sexual reproduction, life changed and changed and changed. Bad changes were eliminated and good changes hung around to make life improve. It happened, it does still happen in the world around us today, and it will continue to happen, God willing. As with all good things, there's a story here, and we're going to start at the beginning, which I'm told is a very good place to start. You know how Iron Man supposedly has all these very situation-specific suits of armor for anything that might ever come up? Life works the same way. This is the first thing we did during quarantine. We saw that polar bears don't live in the desert, and giraffes don't just swim around the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Life changes and adapts in ways that work out. So if a change doesn't help, the organism dies, and anything that doesn't kill it typically will make it better fit for its surroundings. Evolution is the change that happens in living things over time, and this lets organisms fit into their environments better. We sometimes describe this as descent with modification, that expression that means it's updates being made to different generations in a family tree. So basically the parents might have some change, and their kids would have it, and their grandkids, and you see things passed on like that over time. Now we need to be very clear about how this works. That way you won't sound dumb if you ever need to argue about this with someone on the internet or on a cable news show. Evolution is not a planned process. I think a lot of time people who disagree with this or don't want to accept these ideas just have a core misunderstanding about what it is. This is not a planned thing. I think I wrote here it's not a conscious decision. Yeah, right there. It's not a conscious decision. This is not an animal or plant thinking, I want to do this. It's essentially dumb luck. A random mutation or remixing of sexually passed traits may suddenly create something new. We saw that in reproduction. The chromosomes all match up, they change pieces, you get something new. If this happens, and if that change causes the living things to have an advantage and survive better, then the mutation stays and gets passed on to the offspring. We're not talking about an animal deciding that a longer neck would help it better, so that's how it changes. So it's not the giraffe saying, "Oh, if I, only could reach the food on the top branch, I'd have a better idea, better chance to survive. Let me grow my neck longer." It doesn't work like that. Now, if one mutation helps an individual animal survive better, there may be 10,000 other animals that died because they had mutations that didn't help them live. There's always little mutations, always little variations. We see that in the population. We're all different from each other. We all have different traits. We all have different talents. We all have different abilities. For every one thing that helps something survive better, again, there could be thousands and thousands of other things that really didn't make a difference or actually cause an animal or plant to die. This is a process that has taken the entirety of the existence of life on our planet, and it's not a fast thing. Occasionally it may go a little bit slower, but in general, there may be millions, or a little faster rather, but there are generally millions of years at a time between even the smallest steps in this evolutionary process. So sometimes you see these kind of quick little bursts of activity where something changes very quickly. Most of the time, it's a slow, grinding process that takes centuries or not millennia, if not millennia. As an extreme example of this, imagine a person being born today, so a human born right now today with glowing red eyes is their normal eye color. So somebody just looks like they're out of a sci-fi movie. A baby is born with glowing red eyes. Now, if having these glowing red eyes makes that person more attractive as an adult to potential mates for some reason, then that person will survive and pass their traits on to the offspring. So their kids would now have glowing eyes, and so would their kids, and so on. In each generation, we'd expect more and more of the population to have these red eyes, since it's just a trait that's being passed on, like hair color or skin tone or height or anything else. It may take 10,000 years, but if things continue like that, then eventually a significant portion of the human species will also have these glowing red eyes, just because it's becoming more and more common as the kids start having kids themselves and on and on and on. The other side of that scenario is that if glowing red eyes make people think that the person's with the mutation, some kind of demon that's there to destroy them, they're probably not going to let the kid live long enough to pass those genes on, unfortunately. And now that harmful mutation that did not help the organism survive has been eliminated from the gene pool, eliminated from the population. That's evolution. If it helps you survive, great. It'll become more and more common until it doesn't. And if it does not help you survive and actually makes it negative feature, then you're not going to last that long. When we talked about ecology, we kept seeing that term biodiversity. And that was where you had lots of differences in populations, in animal species and plant species. It's a really, really good thing to have these differences, even slight differences. In populations with these little differences and where everybody's a little bit better adapted maybe for one thing or another, there's a much better chance that someone in that species, in that population, has a combination of genes that'll help them survive if something in the environment changes suddenly. If some plants are better suited for cold and some better suited for heat, some plants are better for drier conditions, some are better for wetter conditions, and they're all living in the same area, then if something suddenly happens in that environment, some kind of disturbance, it's a much better chance that somebody there is going to be able to survive. You're probably not going to get everybody, but that's where one little trait will help somebody survive better than the others, and that's evolution. It's survival of the fittest, it's natural selection. These are terms we'll see in a second, and it's going to help improve and direct life in one direction over and above all the other possible chances. Good chances of evolution and good chances for improvement come from big populations with lots of little differences. You need a big sample size with as much variation, as much potential differences you can get, so that there's a really good probability that somebody there has the right combination. And sorry to sound grim, but Mother Nature really doesn't care what happens to us. As long as something out there has traits that help us survive, life will still go on in some form. We've seen adaptations before. Living things are suited for their environments, not because a polar bear moved up north when it retired and decided to buy a nice white coat to be comfortable, but because the things that didn't have the right traits all died out a long time ago. We still see this today. If a particular area suddenly experiences a drought, resources quickly become a lot scarcer, and a whole chunk of the species in that place will probably die. Those that survive are the ones who already happen to have the right traits to fit in, not because they adjusted suddenly on the fly, but because they were already better suited to survive in the event that something changed around them. They didn't need to update suddenly. And if it was instead a really heavy rainy season instead of a drought that occurred, it would be a bunch of different animals who'd have the advantage. It's a total roll of dice. You never know what the environment's going to do, and that's why you need a lot of these differently diverse and what's the word I'm looking for? Different variable traits, animals and plants. Somebody's bound to be better suited for the environment than somebody else. For adaptations to lead to evolution and the changing of a species, though, that individual needs to have three things. Three things must be true. A mutation that causes a change must be present in reproductive cells that it can be passed on. So it doesn't matter if a mutation is in a skin cell, because that's never going to form a new individual. It has to be in an egg or sperm cell. The trait must have a real purpose. So the mutation must cause a real change that provides a new advantage to a species compared to what was already present. And the change that happens must actually give an advantage. If a mutation makes a red bird look green, but neither color really helps the bird survive better, then it doesn't really count the same way because it didn't actually make a difference. One person who tried to explain how different traits were passed down was a guy named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he had two main ideas. One was the concept of acquired characteristics, that any physical feature gained during life, like muscle development, scars, tattoos, anything like that, would be passed on to offspring. He also talked about use and disuse, this concept that all features were like muscles that could be developed. If you used a body part, it would become more pronounced, but not using it would make it go away. So by Lamarck's logic, if two bodybuilders had a baby, the child would have been born absolutely ripped, or someone with a tattoo would have a tattooed baby. And all that a giraffe had to do to get a long neck was try really hard to stretch that neck out. And over maybe a month or so, it would eventually be able to reach the trees, and its baby giraffe, would be born with longer necks also. This hopefully sounds more than a little off to you, because this is definitely not how anything works. And frankly, it kind of makes me wonder if Lamarck ever interacted with another human being in his life, since knowing anyone who'd ever had an injury or pierced ears or didn't have a child with those features would immediately disqualify his concepts. The easy way that someone did disprove this was to cut the tails off mice and then let them breed. The mouse pups had tails. Lamarck had a rejected hypothesis. End of the day, though, this is another good example of science being a collaborative process where failure is really important. This guy had an idea. People looked into it and realized it didn't make a whole lot of sense, but then others built off of his work. That brings us to the next thinker, who was a tad more successful at figuring out what was going on in nature. This man's name? Sad Bob McBeardface. Although, to be fair, you probably know him by his stage name of Charles Darwin. Darwin had a really cool job. He got to travel all over the world collecting specimens of plants and animals, make some drawings of them, catalog life, all cool stuff like that. And he kept noticing how living things seemed to be tailored perfectly to where they lived. Even in nearby areas, there would be small differences between otherwise closely related animals and plants that made them fit in that much better in their environments. These observations eventually led him to the theory of evolution, which is based on a few important conditions. I said before how there could be maybe 10,000 animals that don't survive for every one that does, based on little mutations. And that exemplified this idea of overproduction. Living things produce way more offspring than can survive, because between predators and lack of resources, most of them just won't survive. But you can't know which ones will be the successful ones. We saw this a few weeks ago with the fish that lay thousands of eggs because a lot of them will be eaten before they ever even hatch. Same thing with turtles. You get tons and tons of eggs laid for turtles because many of them won't survive long enough to even be born. Within these large populations, there's going to be a lot of natural variation. Just again, based on random mutations, sexual reproduction, you're always going to get differences in any population that's not essentially just bacteria making identical copies of themselves. And these differences are caused by, again, random mutations, sexual recombination of genes, and that's a good thing. You get these variations. Which variations are better than others, better in quotes, will be determined by competition. And that's when organisms are trying to get the same resources that there are simply not enough of to go around. We saw this in ecology. When there's not enough of something, there's going to be a fight for it. Hopefully this all seems like pretty common sense stuff so far. You've seen this before. This is things you can see in the world around you. We've learned about this before. Living things compete with each other when demand is greater than supply. And this is how survival of the fittest works. Whichever individual happens to have a more advantageous combination of genes will live, and the ones who can't get the job done will die. The idea that this is, again, a process largely influenced by luck and just random chance, and not some kind of planned or choreographed series of events, is natural selection. Depending on what happens, one thing might do better than another, and the weaker competitor will be replaced. Like I said before, if the environment changes and suddenly you get a very, very dry climate, some living things will do better than another. If it happened a different way and suddenly it was a very rainy season, now a different set of organisms will do better than the others. It's just, again, dumb luck. Whatever's going to happen on the outside, we can't tell until it happens. And then some things, sure as heck, better have those traits already embedded in their DNA, because if they don't have that combination of variations that helps them survive already, they're all going to be done. When we talk about fitness, survival of the fittest, about a plant or animal being fit, again, in that survival of the fittest term I just showed you, we're just saying that's a good fit for its environment. It fits in well. It's well suited for its surroundings. It means that the already present differences in a population will all of a sudden become very, very important. So, again, with the bears, is it a black bear, is it a white bear, is it a brown bear? Maybe it doesn't really matter until it does. These bears all may be able to survive in the exact same environment, but if suddenly camouflage gets really, really important because predators are looking for one color bear more than another, or a hunter is looking for one color bear more than another, suddenly those little differences become very, very crucial. But the idea here is that fitness is not at all related to just physical strength or size. As the example you'll always hear of this is how cockroaches have survived forever with virtually no changes. Sharks that are around now are pretty much the same things that have been around for millions of years. They're really, really good at what they do. They survive really well. They haven't had a need to change. There hasn't needed to be these differences in their populations. These bugs here are really easily adaptable. They can survive pretty much anywhere. And the joke you always hear is that cockroaches will be pretty much the only things left after everyone else on Earth is gone. Didn't Wall-E even have the cockroach friend? Right? It's been a while since I've seen that movie, but didn't he have a little bug friend like that? That seems very likely. The species often associated with Charles Darwin are the finches, birds that he spent time observing on the Galapagos Islands. These are some of the species that we can refer to as Darwin's finches, not to be confused, of course, with Atticus finches. Pause for humor. Pause for a joke to sink in. Be thankful we're not in the classroom where I have to see in person and no one gets the joke. Okay, moving on. These are 14 different species of birds, but they all start out as one type of bird. So what happened to make them all different from each other? How could one type of bird have suddenly spiraled out to 14 different types? I just mentioned how one of the places Darwin spent a lot of time was the Galapagos Islands. This is a group of islands off the coast of Ecuador on the Pacific side of South America. Now, the islands are closely packed, and while birds can mix between the islands, they generally do keep to their own territories. Each one has a beak perfectly paired with the food it eats and the work it needs to do to survive in its local environment on its island. The birds at the bottom with the bigger, wider beaks use them to crack open heavier nuts and seeds, while the thinner, pointy beaks are really good for pulling insects out of the ground or out of plants. Smaller bills are usually helpful for scooping up smaller seeds or things like that. This happened because one group of birds arrived on the islands long ago, but over millions of years, natural selection allowed them to develop traits perfectly matched to their surroundings. The term geographic isolation means that when the animals are cut off from other places and have nowhere else to go, they need to be able to succeed in their homes during changing times or they'll die out. Because of this, starting with the same species of finch on different islands with slightly different conditions can lead to the development of multiple different bird types. Natural selection takes over and we end up with 14 from 1. These birds are one of the best and most studied examples of evolution that's still going on today, actually. So because the seasons are so variable in the Galapagos, and you can go travel as college class, you can go on vacation. Because these seasons are so variable in these islands from year to year, we can see big changes to these bird species in a pretty short period of time. Measurable differences in beak shape and size happen fairly commonly, and it's all observed here. So if it's a really rainy season, the plant life will be affected. You get one type of plant and one food source being a lot more common than another. So one type of bird that's able to eat that food will do a lot better than the other type of bird. And in that case, then, if the one bird has a slightly different type of beak, you may actually see it do a little bit better than one's very much like it, and its beak will start to change and they'll actually grow and develop a new species. It's really cool. There's a great book called The Beak of the Finch that follows a family of scientists who spend months there every year. They're college professors and they take their students. They've spent decades there with their own kids and their own relatives, and every year they go back and study these animals. They know each of the birds by sight. I mean, they have years and years worth of catalogs where these birds are like family members. They know the family histories and the inheritance of all these traits. It's really interesting. I want a Pulitzer Prize. Interesting book, good read if you're ever stuck inside for a couple of months and need something to read, if that ever happens, because that doesn't happen, obviously. Weird little aside, a few hours after I went through this PowerPoint to make a script for myself, the Google Doodle for the day became a thing about the Galapagos tortoise, which is another animal Darwin famously studied in his work. This was, I guess, probably from Sunday, I think. I think it was Sunday morning I saw this. But yeah, this is another picture. There's actually a really good Futurama episode, which after I record this, I'm going to see if I can find the clip of it, where all the Futurama characters are animals on the Galapagos, and the professor's the tortoise. I think all the other characters are the finches, and they talk in a pretty humorous way, actually, about evolution and how it works on these islands. I don't really need to explain this, right? I can just leave this here and hopefully someone laughs. A lot of people over the years have tried to kind of decry Darwin as a blasphemous rabble-rouser trying to start trouble, but he was a man of faith who was deeply troubled by the possible social and religious implications of what he figured out. It took a long time for him to be convinced to finally publish his findings in his book On the Origin of Species. And that was in 1859. Darwin was 50 years old then and lived to be 73, so he didn't die a young man or right away. Flash forward 137 years, and he finally achieves true immortality, though, with his inclusion in the underrated book The Further Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix. Now, you're all waiting for this. It's the big moment in his life and afterwards. Here he is, good old sad Bob McBeardface, having a thrilling scientific discussion with the man who would become the villain, Mr. Sinister. And here's the original blue pencil and ink artwork by the incredible John Paul Leone, nicely framed after some lucky fool on Long Island happened upon an online auction and recognized a great deal when he saw one. So I just remembered I had these pictures. This is when I was working at Cold Spring Harbor Lab. You see up the top the famous, what's the name, Jim Watson bucket hat there. This was after the event where those bucket hats were given off. We talked about genetics. We had this statue of Darwin outside the building where I worked. You see here again the hat from the party. I gave him this nice, incredibly disrespectful red, white, and blue bow tie. But whatever. This is a statue of Darwin. He's holding this stick, and right at the top of the stick there you can see one of Darwin's finches. The picture on the right is in the snow, obviously, one year when it had heavy snow. The snow, I guess, was coming at the statue from this direction and not the other, so it's all on the one side and not the other. And I just always thought it looked like, what's his name from Star Trek when Patrick Stewart becomes the Borg. If you get that reference, good for you. If not, don't worry about it. I wouldn't accept my college roommates were big Star Trek fans, but I always thought it looked kind of cool like that. Locutus. That was Patrick Stewart as the Borg. Locutus. Anyway, one last little cartoon here. I think gets right to the point. if the one animal wants to eat the thing because he doesn't think he'll get sick and he just, for whatever reason, is motivated, and the other one really doesn't want to eat the thing that's going to make him sick, who's going to survive? We're going to find out really quickly who's better suited to do well in their environments. Just for the record, I'm showing you this picture because I like it, but humans did not come from monkeys. Think of a family tree. If you have cousins, then you share a common grandparent or some other relative back in time, but you and your cousins don't directly come from one another. It's not like one of them is your parents and you're not their parents. You don't really have technically that much to do with each other. This is exactly how evolution works. Humans and great apes have common relatives back throughout history, but monkeys didn't all of a sudden turn into people. So some offshoot of the mammal family tree separated us from other less developed ancestors somewhere along the line millions of years ago. This whole idea of apes turning into, or monkeys turning into people, that you hear a lot of times as a criticism, is a common thing that people say to kind of get a dig at evolutionists, but it's really just a silly idea. It's not how it works. No one's claiming that's how it works. On that note, we're done for today. So go do the forums. As I mentioned, the email I sent you saying this chapter is open. There's no other homework. It's just forums from here on out. So I think I gave you somewhere upwards of 15 questions as opposed to the normal 5 or so, but nothing too bad. That'll be due on Tuesday. Of extra help tomorrow being Thursday, and next Tuesday at noon. More work will be posted Friday, and I'll have office hours Monday at 10 a.m. I am going to put one extra video up on OneNote. I'll put it in a different little page. You can see it. You don't have to watch this. I encourage you to. It's only, I think, about 3 minutes long. It's a little short clip, but it's actually pretty funny. It's all how we can see evolution and evidence of evolution in the current day. So how we can see it in our own bodies and animals and plants that we say. And there's a really cool little part. If you do watch it, make sure you watch it to the very end, because there's a picture, or actually a video clip from the 50s in black and white of a baby hanging by its hands, by its tiny little newborn hands, off a clothesline, swinging like a monkey. So I know I just told you we don't come from monkeys, but there is still a little bit of a vestigial thing there. So please feel free to watch that. It's entertaining, but otherwise, nothing to worry about, and I'll see you in a couple of days.